According to the 4th century historians Aurelius Victor and the Historia Augusta, 7,000 Roman soldiers lay dead in the streets of Rome itself in 271 AD, killed not by foreign invaders, but by their own countrymen in the bloodiest urban battle the Eternal City had ever witnessed. The year was 271 AD. Think about those numbers. Professional soldiers, wearing 80 pounds of armor, armed with gladius and pilum, killed by civilian craftsmen who had barricaded themselves on Rome's Caelian hill. These casualty figures appear in multiple independent ancient sources, a death toll higher than many frontier battles against Germanic tribes. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal the year that should have destroyed Rome, but instead forged the empire's greatest military comeback. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that shattered everything Romans thought they knew about their empire's invincibility. First, the economic conspiracy that had been systematically bleeding Rome's treasury dry for years, recorded in both the Historia Augusta and Aurelius Victor's accounts. Second, why an emperor who had just been ambushed and defeated by Germanic barbarians in northern Italy chose to wage war on his own capital city. Third, the brutal arithmetic that proved Rome's frontiers were no longer absolute, forcing the construction of walls around the city that had never needed them for 500 years. But here's what makes 271 AD historically devastating. How did the Roman Empire fragment into 3 separate competing states while simultaneously fighting Germanic invasions, crushing internal revolts, and preparing for war against the Persian-backed Palmyrene Empire? Why did Emperor Aurelian order his legions to kill 7,000 of their fellow soldiers to restore Rome's currency? What strategic calculation forced him to abandon an entire province, Dacia, that Rome had held for over 150 years? And why do modern historians call this the year that determined whether Rome would survive into the 4th century or collapse like the Parthians before them? To understand how Rome survived its darkest hour, we need to step back to the moment in late 270 AD, when a career soldier from the Balkans inherited an empire that was actively disintegrating. Late 270 AD, the Roman Empire that had dominated the Mediterranean for 5 centuries no longer existed as a unified state. You have to understand what this means. For the first time since the Punic Wars, Rome wasn't one empire. It was 3 competing powers, each claiming legitimacy, each controlling vital territories, each draining resources that should have defended against external threats. The central Roman state, governed from Italy and the Balkans, controlled the heartland but had lost its richest provinces. The Gallic Empire in the west, spanning modern France, Britain, and Spain, had seceded under its own emperor, Tetricus, who ruled from Trier. The eastern provinces, including Egypt and Syria, had fallen under the control of the Palmyrene Empire, ruled by Queen Zenobia as regent for her young son, Babylathus. Rome's grain supply came from Egypt. Rome's tax revenue depended on Syria. Both were gone. The empire had fragmented, and the center could barely hold. Into this catastrophe stepped Lucius Domitius Aurelianus. Modern historians know him as Aurelian. Contemporary sources describe him as an Illyrian, born somewhere in the Balkans around 214 AD into modest circumstances. Definitely not aristocratic. He'd entered the Roman army around 235 and spent 35 years climbing through pure military competence. By 268, he commanded the cavalry of Emperor Gallienus. By 270, after the death of Claudius Gothicus and the brief, contested reign of Quintillus, the Danubian legions proclaimed Aurelian emperor. They chose him because he was one of them, a professional soldier who'd fought Germanic tribes, Sarmatian raiders, and Persian proxy forces his entire career. Aurelian inherited multiple simultaneous crises that would have broken most emperors within weeks. The Vandals were pressing the Danube frontier that winter. The Juthungi and Alemanni, Germanic tribal confederations, were preparing to invade Italy itself. The Palmyrene Empire controlled Rome's grain supply in Egypt and threatened to starve the capital. The Gallic succession had lasted a decade with no sign of reconciliation. And beneath all these military threats lay something more insidious: economic catastrophe. The Roman currency system had collapsed. The Antoninianus, the standard silver coin soldiers received as pay, contained almost no silver anymore. Decades of debasement had reduced the silver content from 90% to less than 5%. What looked like a silver coin was actually copper coated with a thin silver wash. Soldiers couldn't buy bread with their wages. Merchants wouldn't accept imperial currency at face value. The economic foundation that allowed Rome to maintain its legions was crumbling. And as Aurelian would soon discover, the debasement wasn't accidental. It was systematic theft by the very officials trusted with Rome's money. Contemporary sources record that Aurelian spent the winter of 270 dealing with the Vandal crisis on the Danube. He pushed them back across the frontier through a combination of military pressure and negotiated withdrawal. The Sarmatians retreated. For one brief moment, perhaps 3 weeks in early 271, the empire seemed to stabilize. The northern frontier was secured. The capital was safe. Aurelian could begin planning how to recover the lost provinces. Then news arrived from northern Italy that would test whether the new emperor could survive his first 90 days in power. Germanic tribes had crossed the Alps. They were burning their way through the Po Valley, and they were moving toward Rome itself. Aurelian's first major test was about to begin, and it would start with a defeat so catastrophic that the Senate in Rome believed the gods themselves had abandoned the empire. But here's what the military chronicles don't tell you. Rome's crisis wasn't just military, it was economic. And the men trusted with Rome's money had been stealing it for years. To understand the bloodshed that would soon erupt on the Caelian hill, you need to understand the conspiracy that had been quietly destroying Rome's economy while emperors focused on external threats. Felicissimus held one of the most powerful positions in the Roman state. As rationalis, chief of the state treasury, he administered the imperial mints. Every coin that paid every soldier on every frontier passed through systems he controlled. The rationalis wasn't just an accountant. He was the guardian of Rome's economic lifeblood. And according to both the Historia Augusta and Aurelius Victor, Felicissimus had turned that position into a criminal enterprise. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity. Silver bullion arrived at the imperial mint in Rome to be struck into Antoniniani, the coins that would pay legionaries, purchase supplies, and fund the defense of an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. But the silver never made it into the coins at the percentages the treasury recorded. Mint workers, under Felicissimus's direction or with his knowing complicity, were systematically stealing the precious metal and replacing it with base copper and lead. They pocketed the difference. The coins looked silver. They felt like silver when newly minted, but their actual value was a fraction of their face value. Numismatic evidence, the physical coins that survive in museums today, tells the story with brutal clarity. Antoniniani from the 260s and early 270s contain approximately 5% silver, sometimes less. Historical records show they should have contained at least 20% based on official standards. The gap between official specification and physical reality represented theft on a scale that threatened the empire's survival. A legionary's year of wages couldn't buy a month of grain because the coins in his purse were essentially worthless. Modern economic historians estimate the scale of embezzlement in the hundreds of thousands of denarii. The older, more valuable silver coins still used as an accounting standard, even though they'd stopped being minted decades earlier. The exact figure is unknown and probably unknowable. But the impact was measurable. Soldiers mutinied over pay. Merchants refused imperial currency. Border garrisons went undersupplied because procurement officers couldn't purchase provisions with debased coinage. The empire was being hollowed out from within by the very institutions supposed to fund its defense. Felicissimus had operated this scheme for years, possibly since the reign of Gallienus in the 260s. He'd survived multiple emperors, each too focused on external threats to conduct serious financial audits. But Aurelian was different. The Illyrian soldier emperor had built his career on logistics, ensuring cavalry units had horses, infantry units had supplies, frontier garrisons had food. He understood the connection between economic stability and military capability. And shortly after securing the Danube frontier in early 271, he ordered a comprehensive audit of the imperial mint. What the audit revealed destroyed any remaining trust between the new emperor and Rome's financial establishment. The systematic theft, the years of falsified records, the complicity of mint workers, and quite possibly members of the senatorial class who'd invested in or profited from the scheme. The Historia Augusta records that Aurelian announced his intention to reform the monetary system, to restore predictable value to Roman coinage, even if he couldn't restore the old precious metal content. He announced prosecutions. He promised to execute those responsible for what amounted to treason against the state's economic foundation. Felicissimus faced a choice: accept prosecution and almost certain execution, or do something unprecedented in Roman history. He chose rebellion. And when he called the mint workers to arms, they answered. They had everything to lose. Their lucrative theft would end. Their complicity would be exposed. Some would face execution. So in mid-271, while Aurelian was dealing with the Germanic threat in northern Italy, Felicissimus and the workers of the imperial mint barricaded themselves on Rome's Caelian hill and prepared to defend their criminal enterprise with their lives. January 271 AD. Dense forests near Placentia in northern Italy. As evening shadows lengthened, Emperor Aurelian led his army directly into an ambush that would destroy the myth of Roman invincibility and very nearly end his reign before it truly began. The Juthungi and Alemanni, two Germanic tribal confederations that had been raiding across the Rhine for decades, had chosen their moment brilliantly. Aurelian was occupied with the Danube frontier. The Roman field armies were dispersed across 3,000 miles of border. Northern Italy lay relatively undefended, its garrisons stripped to man and the more threatened frontiers. The Germanic warriors crossed the Alps in the dead of winter, probably through the Brenner Pass, and descended into the Po Valley like wolves on an unguarded flock. Contemporary sources record that they sacked Placentia, modern Piacenza, a prosperous city that had stood since the days of the Republic. They moved systematically through the countryside, burning villas, seizing livestock, and accumulating plunder. The anonymous continuator of Cassius Dio, writing shortly after these events, describes the scale of destruction with genuine alarm. This wasn't a raid, it was an invasion. The Germanic forces numbered in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands, and they were moving southeast, toward Rome. Aurelian, still in Pannonia when the news arrived, moved with the characteristic speed that would define his reign. He force-marched his army, probably several thousand cavalry and supporting infantry, across the Alps and into northern Italy. He expected to intercept the Germanic forces near Milan and drive them back through the mountain passes before they could penetrate deeper into Roman territory. The Historia Augusta records that he approached the engagement with confidence. These were supposed to be disorganized barbarians, inferior in discipline and equipment to Roman regulars. The empire had been defeating Germanic tribes for centuries. What happened next shattered that assumption. The Juthungi commanders, whose names the sources frustratingly don't preserve, had studied Roman tactics. They knew Roman columns marched with cavalry screening the main force, looking for flat ground where they could deploy into battle formation. They knew Roman commanders preferred clear fields where discipline and training could dominate tribal enthusiasm. So they chose different ground: dense forest near Placentia, evening light, when visibility dropped and Roman formations couldn't maintain their cohesion. An ambush, not a pitched battle. The anonymous continuator describes it as cunning and perfidy. The Historia Augusta is even more direct, recording that the empire of Rome was almost destroyed in that forest. Aurelian's forces, caught in terrain that negated their advantages, were cut to pieces. The exact casualty count isn't preserved, but the impact was devastating enough to send shockwaves to Rome. The emperor himself, the supreme commander who just secured the Danube, had been ambushed and defeated by barbarians in Italy itself. News of the defeat reached Rome within days, traveling faster than Aurelian's retreating army. The Senate convened in emergency session and did something they hadn't done in living memory. They consulted the Sibylline books. The sacred prophecies opened only when Romans believed the gods themselves had abandoned them. The religious ceremonies that followed, the Ambarvalia and Amberbium, ancient rites of purification, tell you everything you need to know about the psychological impact. This wasn't just a military setback. It was an existential crisis. The Historia Augusta records that two short-lived military revolts broke out in the aftermath of Placentia, though it doesn't provide details about who led them or where they occurred. The message was clear. Aurelian's authority, just established, was already being questioned. If he couldn't defend Italy from Germanic raiders, why should the legions follow him? The fragile unity he'd built through his Danube victories was cracking. And the Germanic forces, emboldened by their triumph, continued their march southward. Rome itself, for the first time in centuries, seemed genuinely threatened by foreign invasion. This is where it gets genuinely insane. Most emperors, after a defeat this catastrophic, would retreat to Rome and fortify. They'd wait behind walls, hope the barbarians would eventually withdraw when the plunder ran out. Maybe negotiate a face-saving payment to speed their departure. Aurelian did the opposite. Within days of the Placentia disaster, he was hunting the Juthungi south through Italy. The army that had ambushed an emperor was about to learn what a cornered Illyrian soldier could do when personal survival and imperial survival became the same calculation. Aurelian's response to defeat was not retreat. It was pursuit. The Juthungi, confident after Placentia, continued their march south toward Rome, their baggage trains heavy with plunder from dozens of sacked settlements. They had no idea the emperor was behind them, and they had no idea he'd learned from his mistake. The lesson of Placentia was simple. Don't fight on ground the enemy chooses. Don't engage in forests where Roman discipline means nothing. Don't let overconfidence replace reconnaissance. Aurelian had spent 35 years in the Roman military. One defeat didn't erase 3 decades of tactical experience. It sharpened it. He knew the Germanic confederations fought best when they could choose the engagement, when they could use terrain and surprise to offset Roman advantages in equipment and training. So he denied them that choice. Historical sources record that Aurelian pursued the Euthungi southward, but this time he was patient. He shadowed them. He waited for the right moment, the right ground. The Germanic forces, laden with plunder and confident from their ambush victory, made a critical mistake. They became predictable. Armies moving with that much baggage, with that many captured livestock and slaves, can't move fast. They follow roads. They need water. They camp in predictable locations. Aurelian, with his more mobile cavalry-heavy force, could position himself wherever he wanted. The Battle of Fano, ancient Fanum Fortunae, occurred somewhere near the Metaurus River in central Italy. The specific tactical details aren't preserved in surviving sources, which is frustrating for military historians, but not uncommon for 3rd century engagements. What we do know is the result: decisive Roman victory. The Historia Augusta and other sources record that Aurelian trapped the Germanic forces using superior logistics and terrain knowledge. The Euthungi, who'd expected to dictate terms after Placentia, found themselves fighting on Roman terms. And on even ground, with proper deployment, Roman discipline dominated tribal courage. The Germanic forces broke. They retreated northward, back toward the Po River, trying to reach the Alpine passes before Aurelian could catch them again. They didn't make it. The Battle of Pavia, the second and final engagement of the campaign, ended any hope of Germanic extraction. Sources record that Aurelian's forces annihilated the invaders. Some were killed in battle. Some drowned trying to cross the Po River in retreat. Some were captured and later executed or enslaved. The specific casualty figures aren't documented, but the strategic outcome was absolute. The Germanic threat to Italy was eliminated. By late February or early March of 271, northern Italy was secure. Aurelian received the title Germanicus Maximus, greatest conqueror of the Germans. It wasn't just an honorific. He'd turned a catastrophic defeat into 2 crushing victories within weeks. The military revolts that had threatened after Placentia evaporated. The legions were convinced this Illyrian emperor could adapt, could learn, could win. The Senate, which had been consulting prophecies and performing purification rites, breathed easier. The Germanic crisis was over. But as Aurelian's legions marched back to Rome in triumph, the emperor faced a disturbing realization that would shape the rest of his reign. The invasion had revealed something terrifying about Rome's strategic position. The frontiers were no longer absolute. Germanic tribes could cross the Alps at will. A determined enemy with adequate numbers could reach Italy before Rome could properly respond. The shield of distance that had protected the capital for 5 centuries was gone. The eternal city itself needed walls. And while Aurelian was processing that uncomfortable truth and planning Rome's fortification, another crisis was erupting, one that would make the Germanic invasion look like a border skirmish. Inside Rome itself, in the heart of the eternal city, a rebellion was about to erupt that would kill more Roman soldiers than the entire Germanic campaign combined. For 500 years, Rome had never needed walls. The frontiers were the walls. The legions were the shields. The Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of Syria and North Africa. These were Rome's defensive perimeter, maintained by 400,000 soldiers stationed 1,000 miles from the capital. In 271 AD, that confidence died. Think about what this meant to Romans watching construction begin. For half a millennium, Rome's safety had been absolute. The legions fought in Germania, in Parthia, in Britain. Barbarians died far from Italian soil. The city of Rome itself, with its 1,000,000 inhabitants, its temples and forums, its senate house and imperial palaces, sat undefended because it didn't need defending. No enemy had threatened Rome directly since the Gallic sack of 390 BC, nearly 700 years earlier. That assumption of invulnerability was Rome's most fundamental certainty. Aurelian shattered it. The decision to fortify Rome wasn't made lightly or quickly, but the Germanic invasion forced the calculation. Archaeological evidence and later sources confirm construction began in 271, probably in the spring or early summer after the Fanu and Pavia victories. The specifications were unprecedented. Walls encompassing all 7 of Rome's hills, plus the Campus Martius, creating a fortified perimeter of approximately 19 kilometers. The walls would rise 6 to 8 meters high, built of brick-faced concrete 3.5 meters thick. When completed, a process that would take years, they would make Rome the largest fortified city in the Western world. The engineering challenge was immense. 19 kilometers of fortification required millions of bricks, thousands of workers, enormous quantities of mortar and concrete. The construction incorporated existing structures where possible. Tombs, aqueducts, earlier walls, to save time and materials. Legionary engineers, including possibly technical experts from units like the 7th Legion stationed at Viminatium on the Danube, likely provided the technical oversight. These were soldiers who'd built fortifications across the empire, who understood defensive architecture, who could calculate sight lines and fields of fire, and the optimal height-to-thickness ratio for walls designed to resist siege equipment. But the engineering wasn't the remarkable part. The psychological admission was, every brick laid was an acknowledgement that the old system had failed. The frontiers couldn't hold. Barbarians could reach Italy. Rome itself was vulnerable. For a culture whose identity was built on the myth of eternal expansion and invincible legions, this was devastating. The Senate, which represented the old aristocratic families who'd governed Rome for centuries, watched walls rise around their city for the first time since their grandfathers' grandfathers were young. The message was unmistakable. The world had changed, and Rome's response was defensive retrenchment. Modern historians recognize the Aurelian walls as one of the most successful defensive structures in Western history. They would protect Rome for over 1,000 years. They defended the city against Ostrogoths in 537, Normans in 1144, countless other threats through the medieval period. They still stand today, incorporated into Rome's urban fabric. You can walk sections of them, touch stones laid 1,750 years ago, see the gates and towers designed in 271 to defend against an uncertain future. But in the moment of their construction, they represented something Romans had never admitted before. Fear. Not the momentary panic of a lost battle, but the structural recognition that empire had limits, that expansion had ended, that survival now meant defense, not conquest, that the old certainties, the frontiers will hold, the legions will prevail, Rome will endure through strength, had been replaced by a new, uncomfortable pragmatism. Rome will endure through adaptation. While engineers laid foundations around Rome's perimeter, the emperor received news that would make the Germanic invasion look manageable by comparison. Inside Rome itself, in the workshops where the empire's currency was supposed to be minted, a rebellion was about to erupt. And this time, Aurelian would have to wage war not against foreign invaders, but against his own citizens in the streets of the capital he was trying to protect. Felicissimus rationalis of the Roman Empire, chief of the treasury, stood accused of systematic theft. His response was unprecedented. He called the mint workers to arms and barricaded Rome's Caelian hill. The accusation wasn't subtle. Aurelian's audit had revealed years of embezzlement, falsified records, silver diverted from imperial coinage into private pockets. Contemporary sources, both the Historia Augusta and Aurelius Victor, record that Aurelian confronted Felicissimus with the evidence and announced his intention to prosecute. For the rationales, prosecution meant execution. The penalty for this scale of theft against the state wasn't imprisonment or exile. It was death, probably preceded by torture to extract information about accomplices. Felicissimus's calculation was brutally simple. Execution was certain if he surrendered. Rebellion offered the only chance of survival, however slim. What happened next reveals either Felicissimus's charisma or the depth of complicity among the mint workers. He didn't flee Rome. He didn't try to disappear into the provinces. Instead, he incited the workers of the imperial mint to open revolt. These were civilian craftsmen, men who worked with hammers and dies, who heated metal and struck coins, who understood metallurgy but weren't trained soldiers. Yet according to ancient sources, they answered Felicissimus's call to rebellion. They armed themselves. The sources frustratingly don't specify how or with what, and barricaded positions on the Caelian hill. The Caelian hill was one of Rome's 7 hills, a residential district with wealthy homes, temples to foreign deities, and the infrastructure of the imperial mint. It wasn't a military installation. It wasn't built for defense, but the hill itself provided natural advantages. Elevated 50 meters above the surrounding terrain, with narrow approaches through existing streets and buildings, it could be defended by determined men even without formal fortifications. Felicissimus had turned Rome's own urban topography into a fortress. How many men actually joined the rebellion? Sources don't specify. We know the rebels included mint workers, but the casualty figures that would come later, 7,000 Roman soldiers killed, suggest either a substantial rebel force or, more likely, significant support from beyond just the craftsmen. The Historia Augusta records that several senators were executed after the revolt's suppression, implying that members of Rome's aristocracy were somehow involved or complicit. Were they financing the rebellion? Providing weapons? Offering sanctuary? The sources don't tell us, but Aurelian's response, executing senators, not just mint workers, speaks volumes about who he thought was really behind the revolt. This wasn't just about currency reform. It was about power. The old senatorial class, which had governed Rome for centuries, resented the military autocracy of Illyrian soldier emperors like Aurelian. Some senators likely had financial stakes in the debasement scheme. Others might have supported Quintillus, Aurelian's brief rival for the throne, and saw the rationalis' rebellion as an opportunity to destabilize the new emperor. The mint workers were the visible face of the revolt. But the actual conspiracy probably ran deeper into Rome's political establishment. For Aurelian, this was a nightmare scenario. He'd just defeated Germanic barbarians in the field. He'd secured northern Italy. He'd begun fortifying Rome against future external threats. Now he had to wage urban warfare against his own citizens in Rome's streets. And the mathematics were cruel. Every soldier who fell fighting mint workers was one fewer defender of the frontiers. Every day spent suppressing internal revolt was a day not spent recovering the eastern provinces or reuniting the empire. Every resource diverted to urban combat was a resource unavailable for the strategic challenges that would determine Rome's survival. But there was no choice. If the mint couldn't be secured, If the currency couldn't be reformed, if systematic theft continued unchecked, the empire's economy would collapse entirely. The legions couldn't be paid with worthless coins. The frontiers couldn't be defended without functional logistics. Economic chaos would accomplish what Germanic invasions and Persian incursions had failed to achieve: the total disintegration of Roman power. The rebellion had to be crushed. Aurelian gave the order to attack. Regular military units, possibly including vexillations of the 7th Legion that had returned from the Germanic campaign, certainly including the urban cohorts responsible for Rome's internal security, prepared to storm the Caelian hill. The bloodiest urban battle in Rome's history was about to begin. The sound of Roman soldiers dying at the hands of other Romans echoed across the Caelian hill. By the time silence returned, 7,000 legionaries lay dead in the streets of the Eternal City. Before we describe what happened, we need to be honest about what the sources tell us and what they don't. Neither Aurelius Victor nor the Historia Augusta provides tactical details of the battle itself. No chronicler preserved which streets were fought over, which formations were used, how Felicissimus positioned his forces, or how long the fighting lasted. We know the outcome: 7,000 Roman soldiers killed, mint workers massacred, Felicissimus dead. But we don't know the tactical story of how they died. What follows is reasonable inference from urban warfare principles and the documented casualty scale, not specific battle details from ancient sources. The imperial assault must have been direct. Aurelian ordered regular military units to storm rebel positions on the Caelian hill. These were professional soldiers, men who'd fought Germanic warriors, who wore armor, who fought in formation, who'd trained their entire adult lives for combat. They were attacking civilians barricaded in residential buildings. By every conventional measure, this should have been a quick suppression. Urban cohorts had handled riots before. Legionaries had stormed fortified positions across the empire. Against civilian mint workers, even armed ones, victory should have been swift. It wasn't. Aurelius Victor wrote that the rebels were defeated and killed with great difficulty. That phrase, great difficulty, meant Roman soldiers dying. It meant protracted fighting. It meant urban combat grinding through streets and buildings with none of the tactical clarity of a field battle. The Caelian hill, with its narrow approaches, existing structures, and elevation advantage, had become a killing ground. Think about what urban combat means for soldiers trained in open field tactics. Roman legionaries excelled in formation fighting, shield walls, coordinated pilum throws, the disciplined advance that could break tribal charges through sheer cohesion. None of that works in narrow streets where you can't form ranks. None of that helps when rebels are throwing roof tiles from second-story windows or defending doorways one at a time. The equipment advantages that dominated field battles, armor, standardized weapons, training, matter less when combat becomes room by room, building by building. The casualty count demands explanation. Both Aurelius Victor and the Historia Augusta agree. 7,000 soldiers killed. Even if that figure is exaggerated, and medieval chroniclers often inflated numbers, the scale is staggering. For comparison, some frontier battles against Germanic tribes killed fewer Romans than this urban revolt. 7,000 dead means the fighting was intense, prolonged, and far bloodier than Aurelian expected. It means the rebels, despite being civilians, fought with desperate fury. It means every advantage the hill provided: elevation, urban terrain, defensive positions, was maximized. And it probably means that the rebels had more support, better weapons, and more training than simple mint workers should have possessed. Modern military historians note that Urban combat produces disproportionate casualties even for superior forces. Defenders with local knowledge, fighting from prepared positions, can inflict devastating losses on attackers forced to advance through kill zones. The American military learned this in Fallujah. The Romans learned it on the Caelian hill. The difference is training and technology, not principle. Urban defense favors the desperate, and mint workers facing execution were as desperate as humans get. The fighting must have raged for hours, possibly days. Sources don't specify duration, but you don't kill 7,000 soldiers in a quick skirmish. At some point, possibly after sustaining massive casualties in initial assaults, Roman commanders changed tactics. Instead of frontal assaults up the hill's approaches, they may have surrounded positions and systematically reduced them. Instead of trying to maintain formation in cramped streets, they may have broken into smaller units for building-by-building clearance. The specific methods aren't documented, but the outcome is the rebels were eventually overwhelmed. Felicissimus died during the battle. Neither source specifies how, whether he was killed leading a desperate defense, cut down trying to flee, or executed after capture. The mint workers who survived faced massacre. The Historia Augusta's word choice is unambiguous. They were destroyed. This wasn't a surrender with prisoners taken for later trial. This was the systematic elimination of everyone involved in the rebellion. Aurelian had made his message clear. Revolt against imperial authority, especially in Rome itself, would be met with total destruction. When the fighting ended, the Caelian hill, where wealthy Romans lived in marble-clad homes, where temples stood to foreign gods, was a charnel house. 7,000 Roman soldiers dead, their bodies filling streets never designed for such slaughter. Mint workers dead in even greater numbers, though sources don't bother recording civilian casualties with the same precision they afforded military losses. The rebellion was crushed. The imperial mint was secured. But Aurelian's victory had come at a terrible price. The casualty count meant that the cure had nearly been as destructive as the disease. And the emperor wasn't finished. The investigation into who had supported the rebels was just beginning. The blood on the Caelian hill had barely dried when Aurelian's investigators began asking a question that terrified Rome's aristocracy. Who had supported the rebels? The imperial mint in Rome closed immediately. The Historia Augusta and other sources document that operations were suspended during investigation and reorganization. No new coinage could be minted while Aurelian's men hunted for accomplices, examined financial records, and interrogated survivors. The temporary closure meant no new currency entering circulation, a significant economic disruption. But Aurelian accepted that cost. Better short-term paralysis than continued systematic theft. The answers his investigators uncovered confirmed what Aurelian suspected. The mint workers hadn't acted alone. The Historia Augusta records that several senators were executed in the aftermath of the Caelian Hill battle. The sources frustratingly don't name them or specify their exact crimes, but the implication is clear. Members of Rome's traditional aristocracy, men from families that had governed the empire for generations, had been complicit in either the embezzlement scheme, the rebellion itself, or both. Perhaps they'd profited from the currency debasement. Perhaps they'd financed the revolt. Perhaps they'd simply opposed Aurelian's authority and saw Felicissimus's rebellion as an opportunity to destabilize the military emperor they resented. Aurelian's response was uncompromising. Senators died. Not for treason in the traditional sense, leading foreign armies, attempting to seize the throne, but for economic corruption and supporting internal revolt. This was new. Previous emperors had executed senators for political opposition, but usually with at least a pretense of senatorial involvement in civil wars or military coups. Aurelian killed senators for financial crimes. The message to Rome's elite was unmistakable. The military emperor answered to the legions, not the Senate. The old aristocracy's immunity was over. Modern historians interpret this as a pivotal moment in Rome's transformation from the Principate, the system established by Augustus, where emperors at least pretended to consult the Senate, to the Dominate, the military autocracy that would characterize the late empire. Aurelian didn't destroy the Senate as an institution. He didn't need to. He simply demonstrated that senatorial status provided no protection against an emperor backed by the legions. Power had shifted permanently from civilian aristocracy to military authority. The surviving mint workers who weren't killed during the battle faced execution afterward. The sources don't specify numbers, but the massacre was thorough. Families were affected. The community of craftsmen who'd worked the mint for generations was decimated. Aurelian was willing to lose institutional knowledge, technical expertise, everything, to ensure that the conspiracy was completely eliminated. New workers would be recruited, trained, and watched. The mint would reopen under new management, new procedures, and absolute imperial supervision. For the population of Rome watching these events unfold, the terror was palpable. The city had just witnessed urban warfare in its own streets. 7,000 soldiers, defenders of the empire, lay dead because of internal revolt. Now senators were being executed and mint workers hunted down. The psychological impact of seeing the empire's capital turned into a battlefield. Then watching systematic reprisals against the conspirators reshaped how Romans understood their own safety. If revolt could erupt in Rome itself, if senators could be executed by military decree, if 7,000 soldiers could die fighting civilians, then the old certainties about Roman power and stability were gone. But Aurelian wasn't motivated by sadism or paranoia. He was motivated by brutal calculation. The empire was fragmenting. Germanic tribes were invading. The eastern provinces were lost to Palmyrene control. The Gallic Empire showed no signs of rejoining the fold. And underlying all these military crises was the economic catastrophe of worthless currency. He couldn't fight external enemies if the internal foundation was rotten. The purge was necessary, from his perspective, to stabilize Rome's economy so he could address Rome's survival. The investigation concluded. The executions ended. The mint remained closed, but would eventually reopen. And attention turned to what came next. Actually implementing the monetary reform that had triggered this bloodbath. Aurelian had killed 7,000 of his own soldiers and executed senators to secure the right to reform Rome's currency. Now came the harder part. Creating a monetary system that could actually function, that soldiers would accept, that merchants would trust. The coins that would emerge from the reopened mint bore a marking that hadn't existed before. A marking that symbolized Rome's acceptance of a new, diminished, but honest economic reality. In Rome's imperial mint, after the blood was washed from the Caelian hill and Felicissimus's body buried, new coins began to strike. They bore a marking that hadn't existed before. The letters 21. You can hold these coins today. Museums across the world preserve Antoniniani from Aurelian's reign, minted in 271 and 272 after the mint reopened. The 21st marking is visible on the reverse of many coins, struck clearly into the metal. It wasn't decorative. It was a guarantee, a promise, a public acknowledgement of reality. The 21st meant 20 parts copper to 1 part silver. Approximately 5% silver content, openly declared. Think about what this represented. For decades, Roman emperors had maintained the fiction that Antoniniani were silver coins. They looked silver when newly minted. Official records claimed they were silver, but their actual precious metal content had declined steadily through debasement until they were essentially worthless. Merchants knew it. Soldiers knew it. Everyone who handled coins knew that what purported to be silver was actually copper with a thin silver wash. The official lie and the economic reality had diverged completely. Aurelian's reform didn't restore the old values. It couldn't. There wasn't enough silver in the entire empire to return to the 90% content coins of the early Principate. The mines were depleted. The treasury was empty. Decades of crisis had drained Rome's precious metal reserves. So Aurelian did something revolutionary. He made the debasement official, predictable, and standardized. The 21st marking told everyone exactly what they were getting. Not a silver coin, but a copper coin with 5% silver content, guaranteed by imperial authority. Modern economic historians assess this as a limited success. The reform didn't solve Rome's structural fiscal problems. It didn't restore purchasing power to pre-crisis levels. The empire remained overstretched, constantly at war, bleeding resources to maintain frontiers that were too long and too expensive to defend adequately. But Aurelian's reform did accomplish something critical. It established a predictable standard. Soldiers knew what their pay was worth. Merchants knew what coins were worth accepting. The gap between official claims and actual value closed, and that transparency, however uncomfortable, allowed the economy to function. The technical specifications mattered less than the psychological shift. By openly declaring the reduced silver content, Aurelian admitted what everyone already knew, but what imperial authority had always denied. Rome was poorer than it had been. The glory days of conquest and plunder were over. The empire couldn't afford the luxuries of the past. But honesty about limitations was better than continued lies. A coin worth 5% of its face value in silver, but accepted at face value by imperial decree, could fund legions, purchase supplies, and maintain the military machine that kept Rome alive. Numismatic evidence reveals the reform's implementation across the empire. Coins with the 21st marking appear in finds from Britain to Syria, suggesting coordinated minting across multiple imperial facilities, not just Rome. The standardization implies imperial authority had reasserted control over the monetary system empire-wide. Felicissimus's death and the Caelian Hill massacre had sent a message to every other mint administrator across Roman territory. Theft would be met with total destruction. The reform's success can be measured by its durability. Aurelian's 21st system remained in place through subsequent emperors. When Diocletian implemented his comprehensive reforms in the 280s and 90s, he built on Aurelian's foundation rather than dismantling it. The monetary stabilization achieved through 7,000 dead soldiers and executed senators became permanent imperial policy. The cost was terrible, but the result was functional. Rome had a currency its army would accept, its merchants would use, and its economy could operate on. But in late 271, as the new coins began circulating and the immediate crises in Rome stabilized, reports arrived from the eastern frontier that would test whether Aurelian's reforms could fund what came next. The Palmyrene Empire, controlling Egypt's grain, Syria's wealth, and much of Asia Minor, had declared full independence from Rome. Queen Zenobia had proclaimed her son Augustus, claiming imperial authority that directly challenged Aurelian's legitimacy. And behind Palmyra stood the shadow of Persia, the Sassanid Empire that had humiliated Rome for decades and now saw opportunity in Rome's fragmentation. The domestic crisis was resolved. The external crisis was just beginning. While Aurelian restored order in Rome through late 271, 1,000 miles east, another crisis was building. The Palmyrene Empire controlled Rome's grain supply, its richest eastern provinces, and enjoyed the backing, however tentative, of Rome's greatest enemy, the Sassanid Persian Empire. The Palmyrene Empire hadn't started as a breakaway state. It had begun as a solution. When the Sassanid Persians under Shapur I devastated Rome's eastern provinces in the 250s and 260s, including the unprecedented humiliation of capturing Emperor Valerian at Edessa in 260, Rome couldn't defend itself. The Central Empire was collapsing under Germanic pressure, plague, and internal chaos. Into that vacuum stepped Palmyra, an oasis city in the Syrian desert that had grown wealthy controlling trade routes between Rome and the east. Odenathus, Palmyra's ruler, had been granted extraordinary authority by Rome to defend the eastern provinces. He'd pushed back the Persians, secured Syria, even campaigned successfully against Sassanid territory. Rome, desperate for any victory against Persia, had given Odenathus titles, authority, and autonomy. When he died in 267, possibly assassinated, the sources are unclear. His wife Zenobia became regent for their young son, Vabalithus. She inherited both Odenathus's military success and his dangerous autonomy. Zenobia proved more ambitious than her husband. In 270, Palmyrene armies invaded Egypt and conquered the province that supplied Rome's grain. Contemporary sources record that 70,000 Palmyrene troops marched down the Nile, defeated Roman resistance, and occupied Alexandria. Egypt's wealth, its granaries, its tax revenue, its strategic position, passed from Roman to Palmyrene control. In 271, Palmyrene forces extended their reach into Asia Minor, occupying Galatia and reaching as far as Ancyra. At its greatest extent, the Palmyrene Empire controlled territory from modern Turkey to Egypt, encompassing the wealthiest, most populous provinces of Rome's east. The relationship between Palmyra and Persia was complex, and sources disagree on its exact nature. Zenobia certainly negotiated with the Sassanid court. She received diplomatic recognition and promises of support. Some historians suggest she styled herself as a potential Persian satrap, willing to rule the East under Sassanid overlordship if it kept her independent of Rome. But actual Persian military support remained more promise than reality. The Sassanid Empire in 271 was dealing with its own succession crisis following the death of Shapur I. The new rulers, Hormizd I and later Bahram I, provided diplomatic backing to Palmyra, but not significant military aid. What Aurelian faced in late 271 was a strategic nightmare. Egypt meant grain, and grain meant feeding Rome's 1 million inhabitants. Syria meant wealth, tax revenue, trade. Together, the eastern provinces represented perhaps a third of the empire's economic output. Losing them to Palmyrene control was like losing an arm. Rome could technically survive, but it would be permanently weakened. And if Palmyra formalized its relationship with Persia, if Sassanid troops actually materialized to defend Zenobia's conquests, then recovering the East might be impossible. But here's the critical temporal fact that we need to be clear about. In 271, this was a diplomatic standoff, not a military confrontation. Zenobia had declared independence. Aurelian had been too busy with Germanic invaders, urban revolts, and currency crises to respond. The actual war, the battles of Imai and Emesa, the siege of Palmyra, the capture of Zenobia, would come in 272 and 273. No Roman legion fought the Palmyrenes in 271. No battle with Persian-backed forces occurred that year. Late 271 was preparation, intelligence gathering, diplomatic maneuvering. The confrontation everyone knew was coming would explode the following year. Aurelian spent the end of 271 consolidating what he'd achieved. Northern Italy secured from Germanic invasion. Rome's internal rebellion crushed. Currency reform implemented. Walls rising around the capital. These weren't small achievements. Any one of them would have been sufficient challenge for a normal year. Aurelian had accomplished all of them while the empire was fragmenting and external enemies were preparing to exploit Rome's weakness. By the end of 271, Aurelian had survived impossibilities. But the Palmyrene crisis remained unresolved. The confrontation everyone knew was coming. Aurelian versus Zenobia, Rome versus Palmyra, legions versus Persian-backed cataphracts, would explode in 272 and 273. Those battles of Emai and Emesa, the siege of Palmyra, the capture of Zenobia as she fled toward Persia, that's a story for another time. Our focus is 271 itself, the year Aurelian survived impossible odds and laid the foundation that made those future victories possible. But to understand why his survival mattered, we need to understand the military foundations that supported him through the crisis year. Behind Aurelian's survival stood the legions of the Danube frontier, particularly Legio Septima Claudia Pia Fidelis, the 7th Legion, loyal and faithful, stationed at Viminacium. But here's what we need to be honest about. The sources don't tell us exactly what they did in 271. The 7th Legion's history was legendary even by Roman standards. Founded by Julius Caesar himself for his Gallic campaigns in 58 BC, the legion had fought at Pharsalus, invaded Britain twice, campaigned against Vercingetorix, and served continuously for over 3 centuries. Its emblem was the bull, the symbol of all Caesar's legions, representing strength, discipline, endurance. In 42 AD, when the governor of Dalmatia rebelled against Emperor Claudius, the 7th Legion refused to support the uprising. For that loyalty, they earned their titles: Claudia Pia Fidelis, Claudius's legion, loyal and faithful. By the 3rd century, the 7th Legion was based at Viminacium in Moesia Superior, modern Kostolac in Serbia. They'd been stationed there since around 58 to 60 AD, guarding the Middle Danube frontier against Germanic tribes, Sarmatian raiders, and the periodic threats that surged across Rome's longest, most vulnerable border. Viminacium was strategically vital. It controlled river crossings, road networks, and served as a logistics hub for the entire Danubian defense system. The 7th Legion wasn't just stationed there. They'd built the fortifications, maintained the supply depots, trained local auxiliary units, and provided the military expertise that kept the frontier functioning. In 270, when Emperor Claudius Gothicus died and his brother Quintillus briefly claimed the throne, the Danubian legions made their choice. They proclaimed Aurelian emperor. The 7th Legion, along with other units stationed in Moesia and Pannonia, declared their support for the Illyrian cavalry commander they knew and trusted. This wasn't unusual for 3rd century Rome. Emperors were made by military proclamation, not senatorial decree. But it was decisive. Aurelian's power base was the Danube frontier, and the 7th Legion was central to that base. But here's the historical detective problem. We can't trace their specific movements in 271. No inscription says _3_ no chronicle names them at the battles of Fano or Pavia. No source places them on the Caelian hill during the mint workers' revolt. The silence in the historical record is significant. It doesn't mean they did nothing. That's almost certainly false. It means we can't document what they did with the precision we'd prefer. What can we reasonably infer? The 7th Legion, as Aurelian's primary support base, likely provided some forces for his 271 campaigns. Vexellations, detachments of a few hundred men, were standard practice when legions needed to contribute to field armies without abandoning their frontier positions. It's entirely possible that elements of the 7th Legion participated in the Germanic campaign or the suppression of the Caelian hill revolt. But possible isn't quote 5, and we can't claim specific combat involvement without sources. What we can document is their institutional importance. The Danubian legions, collectively, the 7th, the 4th Flavia, the 1st Italica, others, provided the manpower, loyalty, and military expertise that kept Aurelian in power throughout 271's crises. When Germanic tribes threatened, the Danube frontier held because legions like the 7th maintained their posts. When internal revolts erupted, Aurelian could strip forces from the frontier because he trusted the Danubian legions to hold the line. When currency reform required enforcing unpopular policies, the backing of military units with centuries of institutional loyalty provided the foundation for autocratic decision-making. Epigraphic evidence from Viminacium, stamped tiles, funerary monuments, inscriptions, confirms the 7th Legion's continuous presence through the 3rd century. Archaeological excavations have uncovered their camp, baths, amphitheater, and the material culture of a legion that remained cohesive and operational, while the empire around them fragmented. These physical remains tell a story the literary sources miss. Institutional continuity, maintained discipline, professional competence preserved through crisis. If the 7th Legion provided engineering expertise for the Aurelian walls, and legionary engineers routinely contributed technical knowledge to major construction projects, that would be consistent with military practice, even if not specifically documented. If vexellations from the 7th participated in the 271 campaigns, that would be normal procedure, even if not named in sources. The absence of specific documentation doesn't mean absence of participation. It means historical records from the 3rd century are fragmentary, incomplete, and frustratingly silent on details modern historians desperately want to know. The 7th Legion would continue guarding the Danube into the 4th century. They'd participate in later campaigns, that we know. Their institutional legacy was survival. They remained operational, disciplined, and effective long after many other legions had been destroyed, disbanded, or merged. But their specific role in 271 remains obscure, and that's acceptable. Not every story has every detail. What matters is that the Danubian legions, the 7th among them, provided the military foundation that kept Aurelian in power through the crisis year. Without that foundation, none of the victories would have been possible. The Germanic invasions would have succeeded. The Caelian revolt might have spread. The empire that fragmented into 3 parts in 270 might never have been reunited. The 7th Legion story in 271 is the story of institutions maintaining function, while individual leaders made decisions that determined civilization's fate. Lucius Domitius Aurelianus, born around 214 AD in the Balkans, dead by assassination in 275. In between, he did what seemed impossible. He held the Roman Empire together when it should have shattered. Contemporary sources tell us frustratingly little about Aurelian's early life, and what they do tell us, particularly in the Historia Augusta, is often unreliable fiction designed to link him to more prestigious predecessors. What we can verify is this: he came from the Balkans, probably modern Serbia or Bulgaria. His background was modest, certainly not aristocratic. There's no evidence he came from a senatorial family or inherited wealth or position. He was, in the truest sense, a professional soldier who rose through merit. Aurelian entered the Roman army around 235, possibly earlier. Over the next 35 years, he climbed through every rank an ambitious, competent officer could achieve. He commanded cavalry units. He fought Germanic tribes on the Rhine, Sarmatian raiders on the Danube, probably Persian forces or their proxies in the east. By the 260s, he was prominent enough to serve under Emperor Gallienus, commanding the emperor's cavalry forces. When Gallienus was assassinated in 268 and Claudius Gothicus took power, Aurelian remained central to military operations. When Claudius died of plague in 270, the Danubian legions proclaimed Aurelian emperor. His leadership style, as revealed through his documented actions in 271, was defined by ruthless pragmatism. He made decisions aristocratic Romans found shocking, but that military necessity demanded. When the frontiers proved indefensible, he abandoned Dacia, a province Rome had held for over 150 years. Senators were horrified. The loss of territory contradicted everything Roman ideology taught about eternal expansion. But Aurelian calculated that shortening the frontier, making it more defensible, was worth the symbolic cost. Survival mattered more than pride. When the Germanic tribes ambushed him at Placentia, he didn't retreat in humiliation. He learned, adapted, and won the next 2 battles. That ability to process failure, to extract tactical lessons from defeat and immediately implement them, separated Aurelian from the 60-plus other imperial claimants who died in the previous decades. Most couldn't survive even one major setback. Aurelian turned a catastrophic defeat into a successful campaign within weeks. When Felicissimus and the mint workers rebelled, Aurelian's response was total war. 7,000 of his own soldiers died, suppressing the revolt. Senators were executed. The entire conspiracy was eliminated without mercy. This wasn't the decision of a traditional Roman emperor who valued senatorial approval or worried about his reputation among the aristocracy. This was the decision of a soldier who understood that a functional currency was more important than senatorial lives, that economic stability enabled military capability, that some problems required brutal solutions. When Rome needed walls after 500 years without them, Aurelian ordered their construction despite the psychological admission of vulnerability. Traditional Roman ideology said Rome's strength was offensive, not defensive. Building walls suggested fear, decline, acceptance of limitations. Aurelian didn't care. He needed Rome fortified, so he fortified it. The fact that those walls would defend the city for over 1,000 years vindicated his pragmatism. The title quote, _6 restorer of the world wasn't honorary. It was literal. By the end of 271, Aurelian had accomplished the impossible. Germanic invaders crushed, urban rebellion destroyed, currency reformed, walls rising. The empire, which had seemed to be dying in December 270, was functioning again by December 271. He would go on to defeat the Palmyrene Empire in 272 and 73, reconquer the Gallic Empire in 274, and genuinely reunify Rome's fractured territories. But Aurelian was mortal. The choices he'd made, the senators executed, the soldiers killed, the provinces abandoned, the traditions shattered, created enemies. The ruthlessness that enabled survival in 271 created the paranoia that killed him in 275. While preparing to invade Persia itself, he was assassinated by his own officers. A forged document listing them for execution triggered a conspiracy. They murdered the emperor who'd saved them all. The irony is profound. You can't rule through fear and violence forever without it turning back on you. Yet, his reforms outlasted him. The monetary system he established through bloodshed remained imperial policy. The walls he built in admission of weakness protected Rome for centuries. The military autocracy he perfected became the template for the late empire. Diocletian, arriving 13 years after Aurelian's death, didn't reverse these changes. He expanded them. Constantine's Christian empire rested on Aurelian's foundation. The version of Rome that survived into the medieval world, defensive, pragmatic, militaristic, was forged in 271's crisis. Aurelian's genius wasn't battlefield courage or tactical brilliance, though he possessed both. His genius was the willingness to abandon everything that didn't matter to preserve what did. To accept humiliating truths about Rome's limitations so Rome itself could survive. To make decisions that aristocratic tradition found appalling, but that strategic reality demanded. To choose survival over dignity, function over ideology, brutal pragmatism over comfortable myths. In 271, one Illyrian soldier emperor made those choices, and Western civilization endured. Aurelian won every crisis of 271. Yet each victory revealed a deeper problem that couldn't be solved by battlefield brilliance. The Germanic victories at Fano and Pavia secured northern Italy, but they couldn't secure the Alps. The mountain passes that invaders had crossed once could be crossed again. The Rhine frontier, hundreds of miles to the north, was supposed to be Rome's defensive perimeter. Germanic tribes weren't supposed to reach Italy, but they had, and they would again. The first-line defense had failed, and no amount of tactical competence could change the fundamental problem. Rome's frontiers were too long to defend everywhere simultaneously. The Aurelian walls solved an immediate problem. If invaders reached Rome, the city could resist. But they were an admission of strategic failure. For 500 years, Rome's defense had been offensive. Legions fought in Germania, in Parthia, in Britain. The frontier was the shield. Now, Rome itself needed walls. That shift from offensive to defensive, from expansion to consolidation, from confidence to pragmatism, represented a fundamental change in how Rome understood its own power. The walls were the most honest thing Rome had done in a century, an admission that the old system was broken. The currency reform stabilized the monetary system, but it couldn't solve the economic crisis that made reform necessary. The Antoninianus, with its 21 marking, was worth 5% silver, not the 90% of historical coins. That debasement reflected reality. Rome was poorer. The empire was overstretched. Constant warfare drained resources. The tax base was shrinking as provinces were lost or depopulated by plague and invasion. Aurelian's reform brought transparency and predictability, but it couldn't restore the wealth that decades of crisis had destroyed. The Caelian Hill massacre eliminated the immediate conspiracy, but it killed 7,000 soldiers Rome desperately needed. Every legionary who died fighting mint workers was one fewer defender of the frontiers. The cruel arithmetic of internal security versus external defense haunted every decision Aurelian made. Suppress revolt in Rome, but weaken the Danube. Fortify the capital, but divert resources from frontier garrisons. Reform the currency, but kill soldiers to do it. Each solution created new vulnerabilities. Modern historians recognize 271 as a demonstration of Rome's fundamental strategic trap. The empire was too large to defend with available manpower and resources. Germanic tribes could probe any section of the 4,000-mile frontier and find weak points. The Persians could threaten the east whenever Rome was occupied in the west. Internal revolts could erupt when external pressure prevented effective suppression. Rome needed to be strong everywhere simultaneously, but it could only concentrate forces in one region at a time. Concentration meant stripping other areas, leaving them exposed. Aurelian's solution was to accept limitations. Abandon Dacia, a province he couldn't adequately defend. Build walls around Rome, a capital he couldn't protect through frontier defense alone. Reform currency to reflect reality rather than maintain comforting fictions. These were all admissions that the old system had failed, that Rome's strategic position had fundamentally changed, that survival required honesty about capabilities rather than ideology about invincibility. But honesty about limitations doesn't solve the limitations themselves. Rome's frontiers remained too long. The empire remained overstretched. The economic foundation remained weak. Germanic pressure remained constant. Persian threat remained real. The strategic problems that made 271 so dangerous didn't disappear because Aurelian made good tactical decisions. They persisted, requiring constant management, constant triage, constant decisions about which crisis to address and which crisis to defer. The paradox of 271 is that every victory proved Rome couldn't defend itself the old way anymore. Defeating invaders in Italy meant Rome's frontier defense had already failed. Crushing internal revolt meant the economic system was broken enough to trigger rebellion. Reforming currency meant accepting permanent debasement. Building walls meant admitting enemies could reach the capital. Each solution was necessary. Each solution revealed deeper problems. Aurelian bought time. That's ultimately what 271 achieved. Time. Time for the empire to adapt, to transform, to accept its diminished circumstances and build new systems appropriate to new realities. The late Roman Empire that would emerge over the next decades, smaller, more defensive, more autocratic, more pragmatic, was born in the crisis year of 271. The emergency measures Aurelian implemented became permanent structure because the emergencies never truly ended. Rome survived by accepting it couldn't thrive, by choosing existence over glory, by making survival itself the victory. Survival came at a price. Let's count what Rome paid in 271. 7,000 Roman soldiers killed on the Caelian hill. Ancient sources, both Aurelius Victor and the Historia Augusta, agree on that number, though modern historians note it may be exaggerated. Even accounting for possible inflation, the casualty count was devastating. These were professional soldiers, men who'd trained their entire adult lives for combat, killed by civilian mint workers in urban warfare. Every one of those 7,000 was a legionary, and who would never defend the Rhine, never garrison the Danube, never face Persian armies in the east. The internal crisis killed more Romans than the entire Germanic campaign. Several senators executed in the investigation after the Caelian revolt. The Historia Augusta doesn't name them or specify their crimes beyond complicity in supporting the rebellion. These were members of Rome's traditional governing class, men from families that had held power for generations, killed by imperial decree without trial. The precedent was set. Military emperors could execute senators, and senatorial status provided no immunity. Mint workers massacred in the suppression of the revolt. The sources don't count civilian casualties with the precision they afford military losses. But the Historia Augusta's language, the workers were destroyed, indicates systematic elimination. Families were shattered. The community of craftsmen who'd operated Rome's mint for generations was decimated. The institutional knowledge required to mint coins, to maintain quality standards, to operate complex metallurgical processes, all this was lost or severely disrupted. The Germanic campaign, though ultimately successful, cost Romans and Germanic lives that sources don't precisely document. Villages in the Po Valley were burned. Civilians fled or died. The economic damage to northern Italy, lost crops, destroyed infrastructure, disrupted trade, took years to recover from. Aurelian's rapid victories limited the damage compared to what would have happened if the invasion succeeded, but the cost was still substantial. The temporary closure of the imperial mint disrupted Rome's economy. No new coinage meant no new pay for soldiers, no new currency for commerce, no new means to conduct transactions. The economic paralysis, though brief, rippled through every aspect of Roman life. Merchants couldn't operate normally, right? Soldiers' pay was delayed. The machinery of imperial administration ground slower without functional currency. The construction of the Aurelian walls, begun in 271, required enormous resources. 19 kilometers of fortification demanded millions of bricks, thousands of workers, massive quantities of materials. The labor and expense came from an empire already strained by constant warfare and economic crisis. Every worker building walls was a worker not farming, not producing goods, not generating tax revenue. Every brick purchased for fortifications was money not available for military supplies or frontier defense. The psychological cost affected every Roman who lived through 271. They watched Germanic barbarians penetrate to Italy. They watched urban warfare erupt in Rome's own streets. They watched 7,000 soldiers die fighting civilians. They watched senators executed and mint workers massacred. They watched walls rise around a city that had never needed them. The old certainties, Rome is invincible, the frontiers will hold, the empire is eternal, were shattered. What replaced them was a harder, more uncertain reality. Rome can survive, but survival requires constant struggle, brutal choices, and acceptance of diminished circumstances. But here's the brutal truth. Every cost was necessary. Without the Caelian bloodshed, no monetary reform. Without monetary reform, no functional economy. Without functional economy, no ability to pay legions. Without paid legions, no defense of frontiers. Without frontier defense, no empire. The chain of necessity ran from one crisis to the next, each requiring solution regardless of cost. Aurelian couldn't refuse to suppress the revolt because casualties would be high. He couldn't refuse to build walls because they symbolized weakness. He couldn't refuse currency reform because the process was bloody. Each choice was terrible. But the alternative was extinction. Modern historians calculate the human toll of the crisis of the 3rd century at millions. Deaths from warfare, plague, economic collapse, famine. 271 specific costs were a fraction of that larger catastrophe. But they were Rome's price for survival in the crisis year. 7,000 dead, senators executed, economy disrupted, resources diverted, certainties shattered. This was the price of refusing to die. This was what survival cost when an empire stood on the precipice and chose to step back rather than fall. And that survival, purchased through blood and treasure and the shattering of comfortable myths, would determine the course of Western civilization for the next 2 centuries. 271 didn't just save Rome, it transformed Rome. The emergency measures Aurelian implemented, became the permanent structure of the late empire. The soldier-emperor model that Aurelian perfected became the template for Roman governance through the 4th century and beyond. Diocletian, arriving in 284, 9 years after Aurelian's assassination, didn't reverse the concentration of military power or restore senatorial authority. He expanded military autocracy, divided the empire among 4 rulers in his tetrarchy, and governed through military discipline rather than civilian consultation. Constantine, who refounded the empire as Christian in the early 4th century, built on the same foundation: supreme military authority, pragmatic acceptance of limitations, defensive strategy prioritized over offensive expansion. The Aurelian walls themselves became Rome's most visible legacy from the crisis year. They defended the city for over 1,000 years. When Ostrogoths besieged Rome in 537, 266 years after construction began, the walls held. When Normans threatened in 1144, the walls held. Through countless medieval conflicts, the fortifications built in 271 as an admission of weakness proved to be one of the most successful defensive structures in Western history. They still stand today, incorporated into Rome's urban fabric, a physical testament to the year's survival mattered more than pride. The monetary system Aurelian established through bloodshed remained imperial policy for generations. Subsequent emperors built on his reforms rather than returning to the old fiction of fully precious metal coinage. Diocletian's comprehensive economic reforms in the 290s accepted the reality Aurelian had established. Rome couldn't restore the currency to historical standards, but it could maintain a predictable, standardized system that allowed the economy to function. The 21st marking and the 5% silver content became the baseline for late Roman coinage. The strategic retrenchment Aurelian pioneered, abandoning Dacia, fortifying Rome, accepting defensive posture, prefigured Diocletian's reorganization of the frontier defense system. The division of legions into frontier troops and mobile field armies, the shortening of defensive perimeters to make them more defensible, the acceptance that Rome would defend what it held rather than constantly expanding. All these late empire characteristics emerged from the pragmatic decisions Aurelian made in 271's crisis, the Byzantine Empire, which would survive in the East until 1453, over 1,100 years after Aurelian's death, traced its institutional ancestry through these reforms. The military autocracy, the defensive strategy, the pragmatic acceptance of limitations, the emphasis on survival over glory. These were Aurelianic principles, implemented in 271's desperate circumstances, that became permanent imperial policy. When Constantinople fell to Ottoman siege in 1453, the walls that failed had been built on the same defensive philosophy that created the Aurelian walls in 271. Both accepted that empires could be defended from fortified positions, that survival sometimes required acknowledging you couldn't defend everything, that pragmatism enabled longevity even as it admitted diminished power. The historical irony is profound. The walls Aurelian built as an admission of weakness protected Rome longer than the empire itself lasted in unified form. The Western Empire fell in 476. The walls stood for another 1,000 years. The emergency measures implemented in 271's crisis became the foundation for an imperial system that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries after Aurelian's death. The late Roman Empire, which historians recognize as fundamentally different from the principate that preceded it, was forged in the year Rome chose survival over tradition. Walk through Rome today. The Aurelian walls still stand, red brick against blue sky, stretching for kilometers through the modern city. 1,750 years later, you can touch stones laid during the crisis year. You can walk through gates designed in 271 to defend against Germanic invasion. You can trace the perimeter that encompasses the 7 hills and see how Aurelian's engineers incorporated existing structures to save time and materials. History made physical. The year Rome admitted vulnerability created the structure that defended it for over a millennium. Why do historians obsess over 271? Because it's the year that answers a question that matters. How do civilizations survive existential crisis? The counterfactual is terrifying. If Aurelian had died in the forests near Placentia, as countless Roman generals had died in ambushes before him, there would likely be no unified Roman response to the fragmenting empire. The Gallic Empire would probably have remained independent. The Palmyrene Empire would have consolidated control over the East with Persian backing. The central Roman state, reduced to Italy and the Balkans, would have become just one of several competing successors to the Roman Empire rather than the empire itself. Western civilization, as we understand it, built on the foundation of Roman law, administration, and cultural continuity, might not exist in recognizable form. The Parthian Empire, facing similar pressures in 224, collapsed. The Arsacid dynasty that had ruled Persia for nearly 5 centuries was overthrown by the Sassanids and permanently disappeared from history. They faced external pressure, internal revolts, economic crisis, the same combination that struck Rome in 271. They didn't survive. Rome did. The difference wasn't inevitability or divine favor. The difference was leadership, luck, and the willingness to abandon pride for survival. Historians debate the specific factors that enabled Rome's survival. Was it Aurelian's individual competence, the institutional resilience of the legions, the fragmentation of Rome's enemies, who never coordinated their attacks? Pure luck that Aurelian wasn't killed at Placentia? Probably all of these factors mattered. But what's undeniable is that 271 was the hinge point. The year before, the empire was fragmenting, and no solution was obvious. The year after, reunification was possible. What happened in between determined the course of the next 2 centuries. The military history lesson is equally important. 271 demonstrates that tactical brilliance isn't enough. Aurelian won at Fano and Pavia through superior tactics. He suppressed the Caelian revolt through military force. But the strategic problems, frontier vulnerability, economic weakness, overextension, remained. Historians recognize that Rome's crisis couldn't be solved by winning battles. It required structural transformation, acceptance of new realities, fundamental changes to how the empire understood its own capabilities. Aurelian's genius was recognizing this, making the hard choices, implementing changes that traditional Romans found horrifying, but that reality demanded. The institutional question fascinates sociologists and historians who study civilizational collapse. Rome survived 271 by transforming its institutions rather than trying to restore old forms. The Principate, Augustus's system of disguised autocracy with senatorial consultation, died in 271's crisis. The dominate, undisguised military autocracy was born. The emergency. Measures became permanent because the emergency never ended. That institutional flexibility, the ability to recognize when old systems failed and build new ones, may be the most important factor in Rome's survival. Comparative studies of empire collapse consistently cite Rome as the exceptional case. the empire that faced terminal crisis and survived by transforming rather than dying. 271 is the year the transformation crystallized. Every civilization faces its moment of existential crisis. Most don't survive. Rome did, and 271 is when survival was secured. Understanding how and why matters for anyone trying to understand how complex societies respond to systemic failure, how institutions adapt under pressure, how individuals can affect historical outcomes. 271 matters because it's the year survival was chosen over extinction. Not through miraculous intervention, not through restored glory, but through brutal pragmatism, ruthless decision-making, and the willingness to transform everything to preserve what mattered. That choice, survival over pride, function over ideology, transformation over tradition, is what historians study when they study 271. It's the year Rome learned that sometimes surviving without glory is better than dying with it. 271 AD, the year Rome died and refused to stay dead. List the crises. Germanic invasion penetrating to Italy. Emperor ambushed and defeated. 7,000 soldiers killed in urban warfare against civilians. Currency worthless from systematic embezzlement. Senators executed for conspiracy. Empire fragmented into 3 competing states. Frontiers failing across thousands of miles. Grain supply controlled by breakaway empire. Persian shadow threatening the east. Each crisis individually could have destroyed the empire. The combination should have been fatal. Yet, Rome endured. The cost of survival was terrible. 7,000 dead in the streets of the capital. Mint workers massacred. Senators executed without trial. Walls built around a city that had never needed them in 500 years. Currency debased to 5% silver and openly admitted as such. A province, Dacia, abandoned after 150 years of Roman rule. Pride shattered, certainties destroyed, the myth of invincibility dead. But Rome remained. Broken, diminished, transformed, but functioning. The empire that seemed to be collapsing in December 270 was operational again by December 271. Aurelian's achievement was choosing reality over ideology. Traditional Roman thought said Rome's strength was offensive expansion. Aurelian built defensive walls. Roman pride said currency should be silver. Aurelian marked coins with their actual copper content. Roman tradition said senators were sacrosanct. Aurelian executed them for economic crimes. Roman ideology said frontiers were absolute. Aurelian abandoned indefensible territory. Every decision violated what Romans thought made them strong. Every decision was necessary for survival. The lesson isn't that violence solves problems, or that autocracy is superior to democracy, or that military force guarantees success. The lesson is that survival sometimes requires abandoning everything you thought defined you to preserve anything that actually matters. Aurelian killed 7,000 Roman soldiers to fix the currency because a functional economy was more important than avoiding internal bloodshed. He built walls around Rome because a defended capital was more important than maintaining the fiction of invulnerability. He executed senators because eliminating systemic corruption was more important than respecting traditional privilege. Each choice was brutal. Each choice was necessary. Survival demanded brutal necessity. The empire Aurelian saved would last 2 more centuries in the West, until 476, when the last Western emperor was deposed. It would last 12 more centuries in the East, as Byzantium, guarding Constantinople until 1453, when Ottoman siege finally broke the walls and ended Roman continuity. That's over 1,000 years of survival built on the foundation of 271's brutal choices. The emergency measures Aurelian implemented became the permanent structure because the emergency, external pressure, internal weakness, constant triage between competing crises, never truly ended. Every civilization eventually faces its 271 moment, the year when accumulated problems come due simultaneously, when old solutions no longer work, when comfortable assumptions prove false, when survival requires transformation. Most civilizations don't survive those moments. They collapse, fragment, disappear into history as cautionary examples. Rome survived, not through miracle or manifest destiny, but through one man's willingness to do whatever survival required and an institutional framework resilient enough to implement radical changes. The Aurelian walls still stand in Rome. Walk sections of them if you visit. Touch the brick and mortar laid 1,750 years ago, in the year Rome should have died. They're more than fortifications. They're testimony to the year survival mattered more than pride. Function mattered more than ideology, and transformation mattered more than tradition. They're physical proof that civilizations can survive existential crisis if they're willing to change everything to remain anything. 271 wasn't the year Rome triumphed. It was the year Rome survived. And sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. What followed 271 proved Aurelian's reforms worked. In 272 and 73, using the stabilized currency from his bloody reform, employing the tactical lessons learned from Placentia, he marched east. The Palmyrene Empire, that threat we discussed, fell to his legions at the battles of Imai and Emesa. Contemporary sources record that Queen Zenobia fled toward Persia but was captured crossing the Euphrates. By 273, Rome was reunified. By 274, even the breakaway Gallic Empire had returned to the fold. The Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, had earned his title. But he'd earned it through the brutal foundation laid in 271. In 275, while preparing to invade Persia itself, Aurelian was assassinated. A forged document listing officers for execution triggered a conspiracy among his own commanders. They killed the emperor who'd saved them all. The irony is profound. The ruthlessness that enabled survival in 271 created the paranoia that killed him in 275. You can't rule through fear and violence forever without it turning back on you. But Aurelian's reforms outlasted him. Diocletian, arriving in 284, built his tetrarchy on Aurelian's foundation. Constantine's Christian empire rested on the military autocracy Aurelian established. The late Roman Empire, the version that actually survived into the medieval world, was forged in 271's crisis. The emergency measures became permanent structure. The walls meant for a desperate year still protected Rome when the Ostrogoths besieged it in 537. That's 266 years of service from fortifications built in panic. We remember 271 because it proves survival isn't about being the strongest or the richest or the most righteous. It's about making the hard choices when they matter most. Aurelian abandoned territory, killed his own soldiers, destroyed ancient traditions, and accepted humiliating truths. And because he did, Roman civilization continued for 12 more centuries. The lesson isn't that violence solves problems. The lesson is that survival sometimes requires transforming everything you are to preserve anything that matters. Every empire, every civilization, every institution eventually faces its 271 moment, the year when all the accumulated problems come due at once. Most don't survive. Rome did. Not through miracle or manifest destiny, but through one man's willingness to do whatever survival required. That's not inspiring in any comfortable way, but it's honest. And honesty is what 271 teaches us. See clearly, choose survival, pay the price, endure. The Aurelian walls still stand in Rome. Touch them if you ever visit. Feel the brick and mortar laid 1750 years ago in the year Rome should have died. They're more than fortifications. They're testament to the year survival mattered more than pride, the year Rome chose to live.